Canada is a world leader when it comes to critical minerals, and America wants in. Washington has just bought stakes in two BC-based critical mineral companies, sending their stocks soaring. The U.S. bought a 10% stake of Trilogy Metals for $35.6 million and a 5% stake in Vancouver-based Lithium Americas. Ottawa had blocked foreign investments in the Canadian critical mineral sector in the case of China, citing national security concerns. But it's not yet known how any potential American stakes will play out.
When Washington announced it had quietly bought stakes in two Canadian mining companies, it sent shockwaves across both economies. For decades, the United States had wielded tariffs as weapons, tools of pressure, not partnership. But this time, it didn't raise a tax. It opened its wallet. 10% of Trilogy Metals, $35.6 million, 5% of Lithium Americas, both based in British Columbia. For a nation built on free market pride, America had become an investor in its neighbor's ground. And in that quiet transaction, something fundamental began to shift. To the White House, the move looked like a masterstroke, a clean play to secure control over the resources shaping the future: lithium, cobalt, rare earths, the lifeblood of electric cars, batteries, and modern warfare. But in Ottawa, the message was far more complicated. For the first time in generations, the world's largest economy had bought into Canada, and in doing so, handed it leverage that no trade deal ever could. What began as an investment soon became a subtle power reversal. After years of tariff battles over steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos, Canada, long the junior partner, suddenly held something Washington couldn't easily replace: control of the materials that make the modern world move. This was not an impulsive purchase. It reflected a philosophy emerging in Trump's second term, a shift from confrontation to ownership. Instead of taxing competitors, Washington began buying into industries it deemed essential to national security. Critical minerals became the new battlefield. Officials claimed it was about reducing dependence on China, which still dominates global lithium-ion battery production. The U.S. Geological Survey confirmed what insiders already knew: America's lithium supply chain runs through Chile and Argentina, not Nevada or North Carolina. So Washington turned north. If the U.S. couldn't outmine China, it would outinvest its closest ally. For Canada, the move was paradoxical, both opportunity and intrusion. Money was flowing in, yes, but it came wrapped in political intent. By taking equity stakes, the U.S. government no longer stood apart from the market. It had become a participant, a shareholder subject to Canadian law. That subtle distinction meant everything. The United States might own the shares, but Canada owned the rules. Every mine, every permit, every environmental clearance flowed through Ottawa first. Even Washington's dollars had to wait in line. This was the first quiet sign of reversal. Canada, long the polite junior partner in North American trade, now found itself holding the bottleneck. Because beyond the ore itself, it controlled something even more valuable: refining capacity. In British Columbia, plants that processed zinc and germanium, metals vital for semiconductors, defense systems, and batteries, had suddenly become irreplaceable. After Beijing restricted germanium exports in 2023, those Canadian facilities turned into lifelines for Western industries. The U.S. might hold paper ownership, but Canada held the fire, the furnaces that turned rock into power. Inside Washington, some hailed this as smart geopolitics, a way to profit while protecting national interests. Previous government investments, like those in a Nevada-based rare earth company, had already doubled in value. It seemed like capitalism with a flag on it, but beneath the optimism was an irony few wanted to say out loud. The doctrine of America First now relied on Canada First. The more Washington invested north of the border, the more it entangled itself in Canadian law, labor, and environmental policy. America's future supply chains were now under another nation's oversight. Ottawa, for its part, stayed calm, deliberately so. Canada had long guarded its resource sector as a matter of sovereignty. It had blocked foreign takeovers from China, arguing that national security must come before profit. Now, with Washington's money entering the mix, the tables turned. For once, foreign capital arrived on Canadian terms. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Canada would take the investment, but it would keep the steering wheel. Even small stakes gave Ottawa major advantages. Under Canadian law, all deposits, permits, and refining sites remain subject to federal and provincial oversight. No American directive could bypass those gates. Every operational, environmental, or labor decision still flowed through Canadian channels. In effect, the U.S. had invested billions into a system it couldn't directly control, a quiet, bureaucratic victory, the kind Canada excels at. Soft power wrapped in regulation. Beyond ownership, Canada's real weapon was process. Its refining plants, some of the few in the Western Hemisphere capable of handling strategic minerals, became the choke point of an entire industry. American automakers and defense contractors suddenly depended on Canadian smelters to turn raw ore into usable materials. No executive order could change that. The U.S. might hold the mines on paper, but the furnace fires burned in British Columbia. That reality flipped the equation. What once made Canada vulnerable to tariffs had become its shield. The markets noticed. Mining stocks in Toronto soared. Resource funds across New York and London began shifting north. Overnight, Canada's position in the global mineral supply chain strengthened. Inside the U.S., reactions split sharply. Fiscal conservatives warned that the federal government was turning into a market player, blurring lines between regulator and investor. Economists questioned whether this hybrid model, where Washington both owns and oversees, could even be called capitalism anymore. Others, however, saw brilliance, a state that profits like a corporation, a superpower diversifying its own future. Yet beneath all the analysis lay a single, uncomfortable truth, that by investing northward, America had tied its industrial and defense ambitions to a foreign country. Not just any foreign country, the very neighbor it had spent years pressuring through tariffs and trade threats. The irony was poetic. A decade ago, a single tariff announcement from Washington could shake the Canadian economy overnight. Now, those same tariffs had lost their sting. By buying into Canadian mining, the United States had also bought into Canadian dependence. In the boardrooms of Ottawa, the mood was almost serene. Canada had turned years of economic pressure into leverage. Each shipment of refined lithium and germanium crossing the border was no longer just trade, it was proof of influence. Washington could still brandish tariffs, but it could no longer dictate the rules, because power in the 21st century doesn't lie in who owns the mine. It lies in who refines the metal, who controls the steps in between. The strategy meant to restore American dominance had done the opposite. By investing north, Washington didn't just buy stock, it bought vulnerability. And as the lights of British Columbia's refineries glowed against the night, one truth became impossible to ignore. The power axis of North America had tilted. The advantage, quietly, almost politely, now belonged to Ottawa, and this was only the beginning. Because while Washington celebrated its smart investment, Canada was preparing something bigger. A full-scale plan to rebuild its industries, defend its sovereignty, and redefine its place in the world. The next chapter wasn't about resistance, it was about rebirth. Just days after President Trump's meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney at the White House, a different kind of power play unfolded in Toronto. Industry Minister Melanie Joly stood before a sea of cameras and investors, outlining what she called Canada's path into a new industrial era. Her message was calm but cutting. While Washington tightened borders, Canada would open doors. While the U.S. fought for dominance, Canada would build endurance. The era of dependence was over. Canada's answer came in 3 words: protect, create, attract. For decades, the backbone of Canadian manufacturing, steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, and copper, had lived under the shadow of U.S. tariffs. Now, Ottawa was drawing a line. A $5 billion strategic response fund would stabilize factories, preserve jobs, and retool industries for new markets. Each region received its own lifeline: FedDev Ontario for the industrial heartland, Western Diversification for the prairies, and Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency for the coast. Joly's voice echoed across Parliament: "We will not plead for exemptions. We will prepare for independence." Factories once tied to Detroit began shifting contracts to Halifax shipyards and European buyers. At Aloma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie, new orders came not from Michigan but from Canada's naval program. In Quebec, aluminum producer Alouette redirected half its exports toward Europe. What Trump had meant as pressure was turning into fuel for reinvention. Ottawa's first pillar was not protectionism, it was preparation. If tariffs closed doors, Canada would build its own halls. The defense industrial strategy marked a turning point. Billions were pledged for submarines, Arctic patrol vessels, satellites, and AI-driven surveillance systems. Every contract demanded technology transfer and Canadian participation. Shipyards in Halifax, Quebec City, and Vancouver roared back to life. Thousands of workers who once feared layoffs now hammered steel for new fleets. The strategy didn't stop at defense. Through Bill C-5, Ottawa streamlined project approvals and unlocked $60 billion in private investment for energy, mining, and transportation. The Darlington Small Modular Reactor project alone employed over 3,000 people, a symbol of a nation turning climate anxiety into industrial opportunity. Plans for a high-speed rail link between Toronto and Quebec City aimed to connect the country's industrial heartlands like a spinal cord of steel. Jolie summed it up simply, "If we can build ships and satellites, we can build our future." The second pillar wasn't just about creating jobs, it was about creating industries of sovereignty. As the U.S. faced budget deadlocks and policy whiplash, Canada sold a different brand, stability. Ottawa streamlined permits and visa programs to draw researchers, engineers, and entrepreneurs. Universities expanded innovation hubs in Toronto and Vancouver, while immigration offices processed applications from scientists leaving turbulent markets. The message was clear: if you can't plan in Washington, plan in Ottawa. Even global funds took notice. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board hailed the country as one of the world's best long-term havens for capital. In a world of tariffs and political volatility, Canada was marketing predictability. While others built walls, Canada built welcome centers. Then came the spark. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick declared, "America first, Canada second." Cars, he said, would be built in the United States, not in Canada. The statement hit Ontario like a shockwave. Premier Doug Ford fired back on national television. If he wants to destroy our auto sector, there won't be a single ounce of energy going south. His words were more than anger. They were strategy. Ontario supplies electricity to multiple U.S. states. Canada provides more than half of America's imported energy. Linking energy to trade was a warning shot. Canada could redirect its resources to global markets if pushed too far. Business leaders and labor unions closed ranks. Automakers warned that cutting Canada out would cost billions and cripple supply chains that stretched from Detroit to Windsor. Every SUV built in Michigan relies on parts from Ontario. Every pickup in Ontario relies on steel from Ohio. Break that link and both sides bleed. By trying to reclaim jobs, Washington was raising costs. Tariffs could push car prices up by 25%. Analysts warned of layoffs and shrinking profits. The political narrative of America First was colliding with economic reality. For the first time, Canada wasn't a target. It was a lever. Ontario's threat to cut energy exports made headlines from New York to Brussels. In press rooms, commentators summed it up, "You can't run Detroit without Windsor." The continent that once thrived on integration was now learning that interdependence cuts both ways. When Washington tightened the screws, Ottawa looked south and across the Atlantic. Within weeks, Prime Minister Carney and Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum signed a strategic pact on energy, agriculture, and security. For Canadian canola farmers shut out of China, Mexico's biofuel industry offered a new lifeline. Days later, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne flew to Denmark to launch talks for a CETA Plus agreement with the European Union, expanding trade into critical minerals, AI, and defense technology. Each tariff from Washington was met with a new bridge elsewhere. The White House wanted Canada isolated. Instead, it sparked Canada's integration into a wider world. Trade with Europe jumped double digits under CETA. Resource exports to Mexico surged. Foreign investment hit record levels. Trump's policy had set out to reassert American control. Instead, it created a self-reliant neighbor. Canada was no longer waiting for exemptions. It was writing its own rules. In trying to pressure its ally, Washington had ignited its rival. Once a tariff announcement from Washington could shake Canada's markets. Now, those same tariffs forged the steel of a new nation. Power no longer belongs to who collects duties, but to who controls the chain of creation. In trying to weaken its neighbor, America forged its equal. Canada didn't fight back with anger. It fought back with architecture, factories, alliances, and vision. And in the silence between the mines of British Columbia and the corridors of Washington, one truth remains clear: power has shifted north.